When a suburban HOA fined a black man for hoarding springwater, they thought they'd shut him down. But instead, he gave the land back its voice, and nature decided who was really in charge. It began with a letter, folded neatly, stamped with authority, and tucked beneath Byron Leach's front door like a snake waiting to strike. The envelope bore the official seal of the Lakeshore Meadows Homeowners Association, a name that once sounded harmless, but now felt like a threat. Byron stood there in his work boots, garden gloves still on, staring at it for a few seconds before tearing it open. The paper inside was short and cold, every word carved with bureaucratic precision. You are hereby fined $1,200 for unauthorized water containment and aesthetic disruption. Please remove all barrels from view within 10 days to avoid further penalties. He read it twice, almost laughing at the absurdity. Unauthorized water containment, as if saving rainwater was a crime. As if his blue plastic barrels, lined neatly by the fence, had disturbed the fragile beauty of manicured lawns and beige fences. But Byron wasn't laughing for long, because at the bottom, in perfect cursive, sat a signature he'd grown to dread seeing on any community memo. Gloria Penwell, HOA President. Byron let out a deep sigh and leaned against his porch rail, his eyes scanning his small but well-kept backyard. Rows of tomato plants, the peach tree he'd nurtured since his wife's passing, and the steady glint of those spring water barrels he'd filled himself from the creek behind his property. That creek wasn't city water. It wasn't stolen. It was nature's, and he'd simply been taking care of it. But to Gloria, rules were sacred scripture. Later that evening, Byron's neighbor, Harold Denton, a retired truck driver with a thick drawl and an easy grin, ambled over. "Got one too?" Harold asked, pointing at the letter in Byron's hand. Byron shook his head slowly. "No, just me this time." Harold frowned. "Figures. She's been looking for someone to make an example of." Byron didn't answer right away. He looked down at the ground, where the soil had cracked under the heat of a long, dry spring. "I'm not hurting anyone," he finally said. "Just trying to keep the garden alive without wasting tap water." Harold shrugged. "You're right, but reason don't count much when folks like Gloria run the show." That night, Byron couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, the letter spread open under the light. His cat, Mocha, purred quietly beside him, unaware of the storm brewing. He thought of his late wife, Leah, how she used to joke that he'd find peace in dirt and sunlight. He thought of the hours he'd spent digging, watering, and keeping the garden alive through years of droughts and storms. And now this, an accusation that he was breaking the rules because his water barrels weren't the same dull beige as the fences. He got up and stepped outside. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that pressed on your skin and made you feel like the sky itself was waiting for something. Crickets called from the distance, and a faint gurgle came from the creek that wound through the back of the neighborhood. Byron walked toward it, flashlight in hand, watching the slow trickle disappear into the drainage pipes the HOA had installed 2 years ago. That was Gloria's idea too, redirecting the natural stream into underground pipes so it wouldn't disturb the landscape. It had dried out a small wetland behind Byron's fence, leaving behind cracked mud and brittle cattails. He'd never said much about it, but the sight always bothered him. Nature was patient, but it didn't forget. As he watched the water crawl through the metal grate, a thought crossed his mind. Quiet, steady, and unshakable. If they wanted to fight nature, they could. But he wouldn't. He'd simply remind them who the real landowner was. Byron turned off his flashlight and looked toward the HOA sign at the end of the street, glowing faintly in the distance under the streetlight. The same sign that bore Gloria's name at the top of every community announcement. She had power, yes, but not the kind that lasted forever. He walked back to the porch, folded the letter carefully, and placed it under a rock on his table. The night was silent except for the soft rustle of leaves and the slow, steady flow of the creek. Somewhere deep down, something had shifted in him. Not anger, not defiance, just resolve. He would handle it, but not the way they expected. But this wasn't just a story about a man and a fine. It was about what happens when quiet people get pushed one time too many. To most people in Lakeshore Meadows, Byron Leach was the neighbor you barely noticed, not because he was dull, but because he never made noise about anything. He kept his lawn neat, his garage organized, and his temper in check. You'd see him early on Saturdays, bent over his garden in an old hat and sun-faded shirt, humming softly to himself as he pruned tomatoes or adjusted his sprinklers. He wasn't a man who liked conflict. Never had been. Before moving here, Byron had spent 20 years working for the North Carolina Forestry Service, tracking soil health and vegetation patterns across the state. He'd seen droughts tear through farmlands and floods wash out entire neighborhoods. To him, water wasn't something to waste. It was life itself. When Leah, his wife, passed away 4 years ago, Byron had turned that knowledge into therapy. He built his garden from scratch, one seedling at a time. He'd often say, "When you keep something alive, it keeps you alive too." His small backyard became his peace, his rhythm, his reason. So when the drought hit that spring, he didn't panic. He just adjusted. He started collecting spring water from the natural stream that ran past his back fence, something he'd done before, but on a smaller scale. He bought barrels from a local hardware store, cleaned them, and set up a system that looked more like a science project than anything threatening. The setup caught rain runoff, filtered creek water, and kept his plants from dying. One afternoon, as Byron was testing the flow of his system, Paula Monroe, a longtime resident who lived 2 houses down, stopped by with a basket of lemons. "Byron, I swear, your backyard looks like it belongs in a magazine," she said with a smile. He chuckled softly. "It's just a bunch of dirt and patience." Paula tilted her head toward the barrels. "You know Gloria won't like that, right?" He smiled, not taking it too seriously. "It's water, Paula. Not a nightclub," she sighed. "Still, she's got eyes everywhere." Be careful, Paula meant well. She'd seen Gloria go after people for smaller things, unapproved flower beds, an American flag that didn't meet HOA size standards, even wind chimes that disturbed the peace. But Byron thought water was too basic, too natural to cause trouble. He was wrong. Around that same time, the HOA had been tightening its grip on the neighborhood. They wanted uniformity. Every fence painted the same beige, every mailbox the same style, every lawn trimmed to an exact height. To Gloria, these weren't just preferences, they were principles. She often told the community during meetings, "Rules keep us civilized. Without them, chaos takes root." And chaos, apparently, looked like a row of blue water barrels behind Byron's fence. One evening, Byron walked to his backyard just as the sun began to fade behind the trees. The light hit the water inside the barrels, turning it golden. It was quiet, peaceful. He dipped his hand in, feeling the coolness on his skin. For a moment, he felt Leah there, like she was reminding him to hold on to what mattered. Then came the crunch of gravel, a familiar, measured stride. Byron turned to see Gloria Penwell herself walking toward his fence, clipboard in hand, dressed in a crisp white blouse like she was inspecting a military base. "Mr. Leach," she began, her voice smooth but sharp. "We've received complaints about your property." Byron raised an eyebrow. "Complaints? About what?" "The barrels," she said plainly. "They don't conform to the neighborhood's visual standards." "They're not visible from the street," he replied calmly. "They are from the walking trail behind your fence," she countered. "We can't have residents creating eyesores. It lowers property values." Byron stared at her for a moment, measuring his words. "You do realize I'm collecting spring water to conserve resources, right? It's legal. And it's helping my plants survive the drought." Gloria smiled thinly. "We appreciate your concern for the environment, Mr. Leach, but community rules apply to everyone equally." He looked down at her clipboard. "Equally. Exactly," she said, before turning on her heel and walking away. That word, equally, stuck with him long after she left, because in all the years he'd lived there, he'd seen the rules bend plenty of times. A neighbor once built a gazebo without a permit. Another painted their shutters bright red. The HOA turned a blind eye to both. But when Byron, one of the few black homeowners in the community, installed a few clean water barrels to protect his garden, it suddenly became a matter of standards. That night, Byron sat on his porch again, his eyes on the sky. There were no clouds, no sign of rain. Just the sound of sprinklers hissing across lawns that drank from city pipes, paid for by the same people accusing him of breaking the rules. He knew then that this wouldn't be a simple misunderstanding. But the thing about Byron was, he never picked fights. He just finished them in his own way. The official notice came 3 days later, printed on heavy paper and delivered by hand, as if Gloria Penwell wanted to make sure Byron felt the weight of it. The HOA's logo sat proudly at the top, followed by a paragraph that made it sound like he'd committed a public offense. He read it slowly, his jaw tightening with every line. They weren't just fining him anymore. They were threatening legal action if he didn't comply within 7 days. Byron folded the paper, set it down on his kitchen table, and exhaled through his nose. Mocha, his cat, jumped onto the counter and stared at him like she could sense the frustration. He rubbed her head absently, his mind running in circles. He'd followed the rules his whole life, paid his dues, mowed his lawn every week, never parked on the street overnight, never caused a scene at meetings. And now, somehow, he was the villain. Later that afternoon, Byron decided to walk to the HOA office, a repurposed corner of the clubhouse that smelled like lemon cleaner and fresh paint. He found Gloria behind the counter, wearing her usual composed expression. Her clipboard was laid neatly beside her, her pen positioned perfectly parallel. "Ah, Mr. Leach," she said without looking up. "I was wondering when you'd stop by." "I got your notice," Byron replied evenly. "I'd like to talk about it." She glanced up then, offering a polite but distant smile. "Of course. I assume this is about the water containment violation?" "It's not a violation," he said, keeping his voice calm. "The barrels are on my property. They don't drain into city lines. And they're helping my plants stay alive during a drought. You could call that responsible, not disruptive." Gloria leaned back slightly, folding her hands together. "Mr. Leach, our community maintains specific standards for appearance. It's about harmony, consistency. Your barrels, unfortunately, break that visual uniformity." He frowned. "So if I paint them beige, it's fine?" Gloria hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by his tone. "Well, technically that would still require board approval." He let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "Board approval for water. Rules protect everyone, Mr. Leach," she said calmly, her tone clipped. "When we make exceptions, it creates problems. Except when it's someone you like," he said quietly. Her eyes narrowed. "I beg your pardon? I've seen the gazebo on Elm Drive," he said. "No approval for that. I've seen the red shutters on Bayleaf Court. Still standing. But me? You send letters, threats, fines?" Gloria straightened her blouse, her tone sharpening. "If you're implying bias, Mr. Leach, I suggest you reconsider that accusation." "I'm not implying anything," he said, his voice low. "I'm just stating facts." The silence stretched. For the first time, Gloria looked unsettled. She took a slow breath and said, "The rules are clear. You can appeal the fine if you wish, but the barrels must be removed by Friday." Byron didn't respond right away. He just looked at her. Really looked. The woman in front of him wasn't a villain by design. She was someone who believed order was worth more than understanding. The kind of person who needed control to feel safe. "I'll handle it," he said finally. "Good," she replied, returning to her papers. "That's all we ask." But it wasn't. The HOA always asked for more. As Byron walked home, he noticed a few blinds shift open as he passed. Neighbors were watching. Some probably thought he'd brought it on himself. Others just didn't want to be caught on the wrong side of Gloria's rules. When he got back, he sat on his porch with Harold, who'd been waiting with 2 cold sodas. "Didn't go well, huh?" Harold asked. Byron gave a short laugh. "You could say that." "She wants me to take the barrels down or pay $1,200? Harold leaned forward. "You gonna fight it?" Byron took a sip and stared into the distance. "Not her way." Harold studied him. "What's that mean?" "It means," Byron said, "she's playing by paper rules. But nature doesn't care about paperwork. Harold grinned. You're cooking up something, ain't you? Byron smiled faintly, but didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't yet know what he'd do. But deep down, something was shifting. The kind of slow, steady shift that happens before a storm. Over the next few days, Byron received 2 reminder letters, each one colder than the last. On the 5th day, he woke to find a small group of HOA volunteers in reflective vests standing near his property line, snapping photos and jotting notes. Gloria wasn't among them, but her presence was felt in every clipped command they gave each other. Byron stood at his window, watching. His garden looked peaceful, innocent, undeserving of the scrutiny. It hit him then. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. He turned away from the window, walked out to his shed, and started dusting off his old forestry maps, the kind he used back when he studied waterways and terrain flow. If Gloria wanted control, he'd show her what real control looked like. But before Byron made his move, the neighborhood itself began to change, and people started picking sides. Word spreads fast in communities like Lakeshore Meadows, faster than mail, faster than truth. Within days, everyone knew about Byron's water scandal. Some whispered sympathy over their fences, while others avoided eye contact altogether, afraid of being seen as supportive. Byron never liked gossip, but he could feel it in the air now, floating like pollen. Even the morning joggers along the trail behind his fence had changed their rhythm, slowing down to peek at his barrels, pretending to tie their shoelaces. On Tuesday, Paula Munro stopped by again, her face tight with worry. She carried a basket of oranges this time, the way some people bring peace offerings before bad news. "Byron, honey, I think Gloria's stirring folks up," she said softly. She told the HOA board your setup could be a contamination hazard. Byron blinked. "A hazard?" "It's springwater, Paula. Cleaner than what's coming out of our faucets." "I know," she said, glancing around nervously. "But not everyone does. She's saying it could attract mosquitoes, maybe even spread bacteria." He laughed once. Not out of humor, but disbelief. "She'll say anything to make herself right." Paula hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Byron, I've lived here 15 years. Gloria doesn't lose fights. You should just—" "Back down," he interrupted. Paula looked pained. "Sometimes it's better to let things go." Byron shook his head. "That's how people like her stay in charge." After she left, he stood in the yard for a long time, watching the sun hit the barrels. The water inside reflected the sky. Blue, calm, pure. Nothing dangerous about it. That evening, while Byron was fixing his irrigation line, a silver SUV rolled to a stop in front of his house. Out stepped Dean Lovett, one of the HOA's vice presidents, a man who never spoke without measuring every word twice. "Evening, Mr. Leach," Dean said, adjusting his cufflinks like he was at a press conference. "Mind if I have a quick word?" "Sure," Byron replied, though his tone made clear it wasn't an invitation. Dean smiled politely. "Look, we all respect your passion for conservation. Really, we do. But the board's under pressure. Gloria's received complaints, and if she doesn't act, it reflects on all of us." "Complaints from who?" Byron asked. Dean shifted. "You know how these things go. People talk." "Yeah," Byron said quietly. "And people listen to the wrong ones." Dean took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Off the record, you might want to just paint the barrels to match the fence. Keep the peace." Byron smiled faintly. "Peace is easy when one person's always the one giving in," Dean sighed. "I'm just trying to help." "I know," Byron said, turning back to his garden. "That's what makes this worse." Dean stood there for a moment, then got back into his SUV and drove off, leaving a small cloud of dust behind him. By Friday, the HOA had posted a public notice on the community board near the mailboxes. Water collection systems must adhere to neighborhood guidelines and aesthetic standards. Non-compliance may result in legal action. They didn't name Byron directly, but everyone knew who it was about. That night, Harold came over again, carrying a six-pack and a scowl. "You saw that sign?" he asked. "Yeah," Byron said quietly. Man, that woman's got no chill, Harold muttered. Half these people got weeds growing in their driveways, and she's worried about water. Byron chuckled, shaking his head. She's worried about control. That's all. Harold leaned back in his chair. You gonna fight it? Byron took a slow sip. I already am. Over the next week, a quiet divide settled over the neighborhood. One group, mostly older residents loyal to Gloria, saw Byron as a troublemaker. The other group, mostly younger families, admired his calm refusal to back down. One afternoon, as Byron checked the creek behind his yard, a man named Eddie Larson, who lived across the street, came walking over with his teenage son. Hey, Byron, Eddie said. Heard you're giving the HOA a run for their money. Byron smiled faintly. Just trying to keep my plants alive. Eddie grinned. Wish more people stood their ground like that. My wife says you're brave. I just think you're patient. Byron laughed. You'd be surprised how much patience it takes to ignore nonsense. They talked for a while about the weather, about fishing, about how dry the soil had gotten that season. When Eddie and his son left, Byron felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Support. Real, quiet support. Not from the loud talkers or the fence watchers, but from people who simply understood. But Gloria wasn't finished. That Sunday, during the HOA's monthly meeting, she addressed the situation directly. One resident, she said, her voice measured and serious, has chosen to disregard our regulations. We've been patient, but continued defiance threatens the standards that keep our community harmonious. Several heads nodded. A few people clapped. Dean sat at her side, expression blank. Paula sat in the back, frowning, hands clenched on her purse. When the meeting ended, people walked out, murmuring. Some agreeing with Gloria, others whispering doubts. Byron wasn't there, but he didn't have to be. He could already feel the shift in the air. The lines had been drawn. That night, as rain clouds gathered for the first time in weeks, Byron stood at the edge of his yard, watching the faint trickle of the creek. The air smelled heavy, electric, full of promise. He whispered quietly to himself, almost like a prayer. Let nature handle it. But the rain that came next wasn't just another storm. It would become the breaking point for everyone involved. The storm hit late on a Thursday night. At first it sounded like the usual Carolina rain, steady, soft, harmless. But within an hour, the sky opened up and poured with the kind of force that makes you stop what you're doing just to listen. The gutters overflowed, the wind howled through the trees, and the parched soil of lakeshore meadows drank like it hadn't tasted water in years. Byron sat by the window, lights off, watching the sheets of rain sweep across his yard. His barrels filled quickly, the lids rattling as the water surged inside. It should have felt like victory, nature doing what it does best. But instead, it felt like pressure building behind glass. He knew what was coming next. The next morning, he woke to find a bright, orange notice taped to his door. Final warning. Non-compliance will result in legal action. The HOA wasn't waiting anymore. They were moving forward. He crumpled the paper in his hand, then stopped, straightened it out, and read it again. He wanted to make sure he understood every word, not because he planned to obey it, but because he wanted to know exactly what line they thought they could draw. That afternoon, he walked to the creek. The water level had risen several inches overnight, running with strength again for the first time in years. He crouched beside it, touching the current with his fingers. It felt alive. It felt right. As he stood, Harold joined him, umbrella in hand, boots sinking into the mud. You see this? Harold said. That creek ain't flowed like that since the county piped half of it underground. Byron nodded slowly. She thinks she owns this. All of it Gloria? Harold asked. Yeah, Byron replied. But this, he pointed to the moving water, doesn't answer to her. That night, Byron couldn't get the creek out of his mind. He dug through his old forestry maps, tracing the water's original course from decades ago. The HOA's drainage pipes had diverted the flow away from its natural bed, all to make the walking trails drier and the lawns prettier. He stared at those lines for hours until it hit him. The water wanted to go home. The next morning, Byron was up before sunrise. He walked to the edge of his property with his shovel and began digging. Small, patient movements, forming a shallow channel that curved gently toward the low ridge near his fence. It wasn't sabotage. It was restoration. He was guiding the water back to where it used to run, long before the HOA's interference. By midday, sweat covered his back, and the sun was high. The soil was damp and pliable, perfect for shaping. He worked quietly, stopping every few minutes to check the direction of the slope. Mocha meowed from the porch, as if asking what he was up to. He smiled. Just fixing what they broke. Paula saw him from across the street and came jogging over. "Byron, what are you doing?" she asked, breathless. "Letting nature handle it," he said simply. Her eyes widened. "You're not planning something bad, are you?" "Bad?" he said, leaning on his shovel. "No, just natural." She looked like she wanted to say more, but didn't. Instead, she said softly, "Be careful." Gloria's already talking about filing for an injunction. Byron nodded. She'll get her wish soon enough. 2 days later, another storm rolled in. Not as fierce as the last, but enough to bring that steady, determined rain. Byron stood on his porch, raincoat zipped, watching the water begin to move. The creek swelled again, flowing into the path he'd carved. Slowly, steadily, it followed the channel, curving behind his garden and toward the HOA's drainage ditch. But this time, it didn't stop there. The flow slipped past the ditch's edge, trickling toward the manicured lawn that stretched behind the clubhouse. Gloria's pride and joy. Byron watched, silent. The sound was almost peaceful, like nature clearing its throat after years of silence. The next morning, chaos broke out. Half the communal lawn was underwater. The decorative flower beds were submerged, and the small artificial pond near the clubhouse had turned into a muddy swamp. HOA members rushed out in ponchos, snapping photos, shouting orders, blaming the city, blaming the weather. Anyone but themselves. Byron stood at the edge of his yard, sipping coffee, watching the scene from a distance. Harold joined him again, grinning. "You didn't," Harold said quietly. Byron didn't answer. "You did," Harold whispered, laughing under his breath. "Man, you really did it." Byron's expression stayed calm. "I didn't do anything the rain wouldn't have done eventually." And that was true. The ridge he'd built hadn't forced anything. It had simply allowed the water to go where it always wanted to. By mid-afternoon, Gloria appeared, her white blouse soaked through, hair pinned tight, fury barely contained. She marched straight toward Byron's yard, rain boots squishing with each step. "Mr. Leach," she barked. "Did you tamper with the creek?" Byron looked up slowly. "Tamper. Number. I just stopped blocking it." "You caused damage to association property," she snapped. "I didn't cause anything," he said calmly. "I just let the creek run where it used to. Nature took care of the rest." Gloria's voice trembled with anger. "You will be held accountable for this." Byron set his coffee down. "I already have been." "Remember the fine?" For a brief moment, even Gloria had no words. She turned sharply and walked away, boots splashing through the water. That night, the rain eased. The sky cleared, but the damage, or rather the correction, was done. The community lawn would take weeks to recover. The old pond, long dried out by the HOA's re-roating project, was full again. Ducks had already returned. Byron sat on his porch, smiling quietly. Not with triumph, but with peace. But word of what happened spread faster than the flood itself, and by the next morning, the neighborhood wasn't just divided, it was at war. By Saturday morning, Lakeshore Meadows looked like a divided town. On one side were the loyalists, the ones who still believed Gloria Penwell's word was law. On the other side were the quiet sympathizers who'd had enough of HOA overreach. They didn't all say it out loud, but their silence spoke volumes. Byron Leach had become the topic of every porch conversation, every morning dog walk, every group text between neighbors. Some called him reckless. Others called him a hero. Either way, he'd changed something in the air, and Gloria hated that more than the flooded lawn itself. When she called an emergency board meeting that afternoon, she made sure everyone saw her clipboard and stormed through the neighborhood like she was leading a mission. She wore that same crisp white blouse, her lips pursed so tight they could cut glass. Byron, however, didn't go. He already knew what was coming: a formal accusation, threats of legal action, and another round of intimidation letters. Instead, he spent the afternoon walking the edge of the creek, studying how the water had settled after the rain. The new channel had worked perfectly. The ridge he'd built held strong, and the overflow had balanced itself out across the lower terrain, just as the maps predicted. It wasn't destruction. It was balance. Later that day, he got a knock on the door. It was Eddie Larson, the neighbor who'd spoken to him about patience and courage a week earlier. He looked uneasy. "Byron," he said, lowering his voice. "Gloria's saying she's filing a claim against you for property damage." Byron raised an eyebrow. "Property damage?" The pond refilled itself. Eddie scratched his head. "She's calling it intentional flooding, says you redirected the creek on purpose." Byron smirked. "She's right about that part." Eddie looked worried. "Man, I'm with you, but she's got half the board on her side. They're threatening to sue." "Let them," Byron said simply. "I've got time." Eddie hesitated. "You got proof that what you did was legal?" Byron nodded toward his kitchen table, where several maps and documents were spread out. "Got every property line and water flow record since 1986. County archives don't lie." Eddie smiled slowly. "You planned this?" Byron shrugged. "No, I just understood the land better than she did." When Eddie left, Byron sat at the table again, staring at the old forestry maps. He'd drawn lines, marked elevations, and noted every alteration the HOA had made over the years. What Gloria didn't realize was that her precious drainage project, the one that rerouted the creek underground, had violated the original county easement. She'd technically disrupted a natural flow without permission. The irony made Byron chuckle under his breath. That night, he decided to put his next plan in motion. Not out of revenge, but out of principle. He wasn't going to fight Gloria in her world of forms and fines. He'd fight her with patience and proof. He called his old colleague from the forestry department, Dr. Lionel Green, an environmental specialist now working with a watershed protection group in Durham. "Lionel, it's Byron," he said when the call connected. "Got a situation I think you'd appreciate." Lionel laughed. "You mean another bureaucrat who thinks they can outsmart water?" "Exactly that," Byron replied. "Tell me everything," Lionel said. Byron explained the drainage project, the fines, and the way the HOA had blocked the creek years ago. Lionel's tone grew more serious as he listened. "Byron, that could be a violation of the Clean Water Act, depending on how they redirected the flow," Lionel said. "If they altered a natural stream without an environmental permit, the HOA could be liable. Not you." Byron leaned back in his chair, letting out a quiet breath. "So she's barking up the wrong tree." "Completely," Lionel confirmed. "If you can send me photos and maps, I'll file a preliminary review." "The state doesn't take kindly to that kind of interference." Byron smiled, a slow, calm smile. "Appreciate it, old friend." By Sunday morning, Gloria was still marching door to door, collecting signatures for a petition to restore order. Her voice carried through the streets, echoing off driveways and mailboxes. She didn't notice Byron standing quietly near his fence, camera in hand, snapping photos of the flooded lawn, the diverted ditch, and the pond now teeming with wildlife again. Every click was evidence. That afternoon, Harold stopped by again, holding a cup of coffee. "You look like a man with a secret," he said. Byron grinned. "Let's just say I've got friends in higher places." Harold chuckled. "You're enjoying this a little too much." "I'm enjoying the quiet part," Byron said. "The part where nature and the law start agreeing with each other." The following week, a letter arrived. But this one didn't come from Gloria. It came from the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. It was addressed to the Lakeshore Meadows Homeowners Association, requesting documentation for their drainage system and proof of environmental compliance. When Gloria opened it at the next HOA meeting, witnesses said her face turned pale. Byron didn't attend, but he didn't have to. He knew exactly what it said. But even with the state now watching, Gloria wasn't ready to give up. and the next move she made would turn the whole neighborhood against her. The letter from the Department of Environmental Quality hit Gloria Penwell like a hammer. It didn't accuse her of anything outright, but the wording was enough to make her sweat. Potential violation of watershed modification ordinances. Those 7 words were poison to someone like her. She'd built her entire reputation on control, precision, and following the rules. The thought that she might be the one breaking them gnawed at her pride like rust on steel. But instead of backing off, she doubled down. She called an emergency HOA meeting, this time behind closed doors. Only board members were invited, though half the neighborhood gathered outside the clubhouse anyway, pretending to walk their dogs or water their lawns while eavesdropping. Inside, her voice carried through the thin walls. "We cannot let this man undermine us," she said, sharp and unwavering. "He has made a mockery of our community. I will not stand for it." Dean Lovett spoke up carefully, choosing every word like he was defusing a bomb. "Gloria, the state letter. Maybe we should pause before we escalate. If they find the drainage system violates an environmental code..." "Enough," she snapped. "We've done nothing wrong." "But if we push and it backfires..." "I said enough, Dean." Her voice dropped lower then, quieter but heavier. "If we let him win, we lose this neighborhood." Order matters. Discipline matters. Outside, Byron stood at the edge of the lawn, arms crossed, listening. He wasn't smiling. He didn't take joy in her panic. He just understood now. She wasn't fighting him out of spite. She was fighting to preserve her illusion of control. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Byron walked along the creek again. The air was cooler, carrying the faint smell of wet soil and honeysuckle. The channel he'd carved still flowed clean and steady, feeding into the old pond that had come alive again. Frogs croaked at the edges. Birds darted across the surface, their wings flashing in the light. Harold joined him, hands in his jacket pockets. "You seeing this? Whole thing's turning into a nature reserve." Byron smiled faintly. "It's how it used to be." Harold kicked a pebble into the water. "Funny how you fix something, and they call it damage." "People like Gloria," Byron said quietly, "don't see balance. They see anything they don't control as chaos." 2 days later, the state sent an inspection team to Lakeshore Meadows. 2 white trucks rolled in, each bearing the DEQ logo. Residents peeked through curtains and filmed from porches. Gloria met them at the clubhouse, papers in hand, smile stretched tight. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said. "I trust you're here to clear up a misunderstanding." One of the inspectors, a tall man in a tan jacket, replied evenly, "We're here to review your storm water management system and confirm compliance." Shouldn't take long. For the next hour, they walked the property, taking photos, measuring runoff points, and documenting the drainage pipes. When they reached the old pond, now brimming with water again, one of them stopped, jotting something down on his clipboard. "This was previously dry?" he asked. "Yes," Gloria said quickly. "It flooded due to unauthorized interference by a resident." Byron, who was standing a few yards away, spoke up. "Unauthorized? The creek ran through here naturally before you buried it." The inspector looked at him, then at the ground. "He's right. The county's 2002 water survey shows this area as a live stream corridor. Diverting it might have required a permit." Gloria's jaw tensed. "That can't be correct." The inspector nodded politely. "We'll review the records. If the HOA altered the flow without authorization, we'll need to address that." The crowd murmured. A few neighbors exchanged glances. Some even smiled. That night, Byron sat on his porch again, watching lightning flicker in the distance. The storms had become frequent lately, and each one fed the creek a little more. The land was healing itself in real time. The lawns that had drowned were already greening again, and the pond had become a small haven for life. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. But Gloria couldn't see it that way. To her, every raindrop was a reminder that she'd lost control. So when another downpour hit the following weekend, she snapped. At dawn, Byron woke to the sound of shouting. He looked outside to see Gloria and 2 hired workers near the creek, shovels in hand, digging at the ridge he'd built. They were trying to block the water again, piling dirt and stones where it flowed. Byron stormed outside, raincoat half-zipped. "What do you think you're doing?" Gloria spun toward him, soaked but furious. "Restoring order," she shouted. "You've destroyed property and I'm fixing it." "That's not your land," Byron said firmly. "That's mine." "Not when your actions affect community property," she fired back. He pointed at the creek, water rushing around her boots. "You can't fight water, Gloria. You can't own it. It's going to do what it's always done." She ignored him, yelling at the workers to keep going. But as they did, the ridge gave way under the pressure. Water surged through the pile, splitting it in two and sending mud flying across the lawn. One of the workers slipped, falling backward into the shallow current. The spectacle drew half the neighborhood. Cameras were out. People whispered. Paula was there too, clutching her phone and shaking her head. Byron said nothing more. He just stood there, watching as the creek reclaimed its path again. Stronger this time, as if nature itself had had enough. Gloria screamed something about lawsuits, but no one was listening anymore. They were watching the water. Pure, unstoppable, free. But as the water settled and the truth became impossible to ignore, the community would soon have to choose whose version of order they believed in. By Monday morning, Lakeshore Meadows looked different. Not ruined, just real. The kind of real you get when perfection cracks. Mud streaks ran along the edge of the clubhouse lawn. The pond shimmered again, fuller than anyone remembered. A few ducks had returned, waddling past the keep-off grass signs as if mocking them. Gloria Penwell, though, wasn't amused. She'd spent the entire weekend firing off emails to the HOA board, the city, the county, even a local news station. Each message read like a declaration of war. Resident causes environmental damage. Illegal tampering with community property. Request for immediate legal review. But this time, no one rushed to her side. When the DEQ inspectors returned for a follow-up, Byron stayed home. He didn't need to see it. He already knew the truth would surface like driftwood after a storm. Instead, he sat in his kitchen with Harold, Paula, and Eddie, the three neighbors who'd quietly stood by him through everything. Harold stirred sugar into his coffee and muttered, "You think she'll back down now?" Byron leaned back in his chair. "Gloria doesn't back down. She burns out," Paula sighed. "She called me last night, yelling about property values dropping. Said you'd ruined the neighborhood's image?" Byron smiled faintly. "Funny, I thought the neighborhood was supposed to be about people, not paint." Eddie chuckled. "Amen to that." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, throwing bright patches of light across the damp lawns. Kids were out again, riding bikes through puddles. For the first time in weeks, the place sounded alive. Laughter, splashes, motion. Then came the email that changed everything. Dean Lovett, the HOA vice president, forwarded Gloria's correspondence to the board, and accidentally to the entire community mailing list. Every homeowner in Lakeshore Meadows received it. Attached were her letters, recordings, and a copy of the state's inspection summary. And right there, in bold text, was the line that made everyone pause. The HOA's previous alterations to the natural stream appear to have violated county environmental standards. Immediate restoration is recommended. It wasn't an accusation. It was a polite directive, but for Gloria, it was a death sentence. Byron's phone started ringing almost immediately. First Paula, then Eddie, then a woman he barely knew from 2 streets over. "Byron, they sent it to everyone," Paula said, breathless. "Everyone knows now." "Knows what?" he asked, pretending not to understand. "That you were right." Later that day, Byron took his usual walk along the creek. The air felt lighter somehow. A few neighbors waved from their porches, the same people who used to avoid looking at him. One man even stopped his car to say, "Hey Leach, saw the email. Guess you showed them, huh?" Byron smiled, though not in triumph. "Didn't show anyone anything," he said. "Nature did the work." Back at the clubhouse, things weren't so calm. Witnesses said Gloria was pacing near the board table, her voice trembling as she argued with Dean. "You were supposed to back me up," she said. "I did," Dean replied quietly, "until it stopped being about the rules." "This neighborhood needs order, Dean," she shouted. "Without it, it'll fall apart." He stood, gathering his papers. Maybe it needs balance more than order. That was the last meeting Gloria ever led. 2 weeks later, she announced her resignation for health reasons, though everyone knew the truth. The HOA elected new leadership, quieter, less controlling, more open. The first change they made was simple. They approved rainwater collection systems for all residents, provided they were safely sealed. When Harold heard the news, he nearly choked on his coffee. "They turned your rebellion into a regulation," he said, laughing. Byron grinned. "Guess we finally found common ground." The next few weeks passed peacefully. The neighborhood started to heal. People began planting again, wildflowers, native shrubs, fruit trees. The pond became a gathering spot for kids and retirees alike. Some evenings, Byron would sit by it with Mocha curled on his lap, watching the sunset shimmer across the surface. But even in peace, there were reminders of the fight. One afternoon, a delivery driver pulled up, handed Byron a package, and said, "Hey, aren't you the guy from the HOA video?" Byron looked confused. "What video?" "Someone uploaded footage of that day, when the water broke through the ridge. It's all over social media. Folks are calling it the day nature won." Byron laughed softly. He hadn't wanted fame. All he ever wanted was fairness. That evening, he clicked on the video link. There he was, standing calm in the rain, while Gloria yelled from the other side of the creek. The caption read, "He didn't fight her. He just let nature balance the books." Byron closed his laptop, smiled, and whispered, "Guess that's one way to say it." Outside, the pond rippled with the wind. The same ducks floated lazily near the reeds. Everything felt steady again. Not perfect, but honest. But Byron's quiet victory wasn't the end. The story would soon spill beyond lakeshore meadows, stirring debates far beyond his little patch of land. The video didn't just go viral, it exploded. Within 3 days, the day nature won had racked up hundreds of thousands of views across TikTok, Facebook, and local news channels. Clips of Byron standing in the rain, calm and composed, circulated with headlines like, "Man outsmarts HOA using nature's law," and "When rules go too far." At first, Byron didn't even realize how far it had gone. It was Paula who called him the next morning. "Byron, you're on Channel 9, she said, half laughing, half panicked. "What?" he muttered, still half asleep. "Turn on your TV." There he was, on screen, a still image of him beside the flooded lawn, captioned, "Local resident challenges HOA over water rights." The anchor explained the situation as if it were a civil rights story. They talked about property disputes, environmental laws, and how the state investigation had turned against the very association that fined him. Byron shook his head. "I didn't want all this." Paula's voice softened. "You didn't, but people needed to see it." By noon, reporters were leaving messages on his phone. Environmental groups were tagging him online, praising his stand for eco-justice. A few legal experts even weighed in, debating whether HOAs across the country should have the right to regulate natural resources on private land. But not everyone was cheering. Some residents, still loyal to Gloria, accused Byron of turning their community into a spectacle. Anonymous posts popped up in neighborhood forums, calling him a troublemaker and an attention seeker. One even wrote, he just wanted to be famous. He didn't care about the damage. Byron ignored it all. Fame didn't interest him. What did interest him was how many people, strangers even, were suddenly reaching out with their own stories. One man from Arizona wrote, "Our HOA banned solar panels, said they were ugly. You gave me courage to fight back." A woman from Florida messaged, "They fined me for planting native flowers. Thank you for showing it's okay to stand up." It hit Byron then that what had happened wasn't just about water. It was about people tired of being told that conformity was the same as community. Later that week, a journalist from the Raleigh Observer came by to interview him. Her name was Melissa Truitt, a young reporter with a calm presence and an old-school tape recorder. She sat with Byron on his porch, notebook in hand. "Mr. Leach," she began, "you've become somewhat of a symbol. People are calling you the man who let nature fight back." He chuckled quietly. Symbol's a big word for someone who just dug a trench. But you made a point, Melissa said. A simple one, but it resonated. That sometimes nature knows better than regulations. Byron looked out at the pond, the way sunlight danced on the water's surface. We've forgotten how to listen, he said. Everything's about control now. Straight lines, perfect lawns, everything the same color. Nature doesn't work like that. It's messy, unpredictable, but it always finds balance. Melissa smiled faintly. You sound like a philosopher. Just a man who's been outside long enough to notice, he replied. When the article was published 2 days later, it painted Byron not as a rebel, but as a realist. A man who'd quietly stood up for common sense. The headline read, "One man's backyard battle sparked a bigger question. Who really owns nature?" The story went national after that. Morning shows discussed it, environmental blogs analyzed it, and even a few law professors debated the implications. Byron's calm defiance had become a mirror, one that reflected people's growing frustration with systems that valued uniformity over understanding. Gloria, meanwhile, disappeared from view. Rumor had it she sold her house and moved to another community outside Greensboro. No one could confirm it, but few cared to. Her departure felt like a sigh of relief that drifted through every cul-de-sac. One evening, Harold joined Byron by the pond again, tossing bits of bread to the ducks. You ever think it'd get this big? Harold asked. Byron shook his head. Didn't plan on it. I just wanted to keep my garden alive. Funny how things start small and end up changing people, Harold said. Byron smiled. Guess small things always do. That's how nature works. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't need filling. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, and the reflection rippled across the water like brushed glass. In that moment, Byron realized the fight had never really been about him and Gloria. It was about something deeper, the constant tug-of-war between control and coexistence, between man's obsession with order and nature's quiet insistence on freedom. And maybe, he thought, that was the lesson people needed. But before the world moved on, Byron still had one last thing to say, a final reflection that would remind everyone why the simplest acts can carry the deepest meaning. A few weeks later, when the noise had started to die down and the headlines faded to the next trending outrage, Byron Leach found himself alone by the pond again. The water was still, catching the light of an early evening sun. Cicadas hummed in the distance, their rhythm steady and familiar. For the first time in months, the neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. He sat in the same old chair that Leah used to drag out for their summer picnics. Mocha curled up beside him, tail flicking lazily. The air smelled like wet earth and honeysuckle. The creek murmured nearby, alive and free, winding exactly where it wanted to go. He closed his eyes for a moment. All he could hear was the water and the rustling leaves. It didn't sound like rebellion anymore. It sounded like peace. A knock on the fence pulled him from the thought. It was Paula Monroe again, this time holding 2 glasses of iced tea. Thought you might need this, she said with a smile. Byron grinned. You just like being part of the winning team, she laughed softly. Please, you think anyone really wins with an HOA? They sat for a while, sipping tea in comfortable silence. Finally, Paula said, You know, I think people needed this. Not the fight, but the reminder. What reminder's that? Byron asked. That rules are supposed to protect people, not cage them, she said. You didn't fight for water, Byron. You fought for common sense. He smiled at that. She wasn't wrong. Later that evening, Byron decided to take one more walk through the neighborhood. It looked different now, not because of the flood or the news, but because of how people carried themselves. Kids played near the pond without parents rushing to scold them. Neighbors talked across driveways again. Someone had even started planting wildflowers along the creek, letting color return where it had once been forbidden. As Byron passed the community board, he noticed a new announcement pinned to it. Residents are encouraged to participate in the Lakeshore Meadows Green Initiative promoting sustainable gardening, natural water collection, and environmental restoration. Inspired by local resident Mr. Byron Leach. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he chuckled under his breath. Guess nature joined the HOA after all. The next morning, he got a call from Melissa Truitt, the reporter who'd interviewed him. Byron, I just wanted to let you know, she said. Your story's being included in a national feature about environmental responsibility and community reform. He sighed lightly. I didn't mean for it to turn into a movement. I think that's what makes it work, she replied. You didn't force anything. You just reminded people that sometimes letting go of control is the solution. He thanked her, hung up, and walked outside again. The grass was still damp with morning dew, the air warm but gentle. The barrels, now painted a neutral shade after all the chaos, stood quietly by his fence, full of clear water. They weren't defiant anymore. They were part of the landscape. A few houses down, Eddie Larson waved from his driveway. Hey, Byron! Got my own setup now, he called out proudly, pointing to a row of new rain barrels. Figured if it's legal now, might as well do it right. Byron laughed. Just make sure Gloria's ghost doesn't show up with a clipboard. Eddie grinned. If she does, I'll offer her a drink. Byron walked back to his porch, sat down, and took a slow breath. The wind rippled across the pond, sending small circles outward, one after another. That's how change worked. Not all at once, but in ripples. One person does the right thing, and someone else finds courage in that. He thought about Leah again. Her voice, her warmth, how she used to tell him that patience wasn't about waiting quietly, but standing steady when things didn't make sense. Maybe that's what he'd done, without even realizing it. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in orange and gold, Byron spoke softly, not to anyone in particular. Nature doesn't hurry, but it gets everything done. I guess we should too. He stood up, dusted off his jeans, and looked around the neighborhood, his neighborhood, finally at peace. There was something satisfying about knowing he didn't win by yelling or fighting or breaking rules. He'd won by trusting something bigger, older, and wiser than any HOA regulation. Balance. He turned back toward the camera he'd set up earlier to record a message for the online audience that had grown around his story. The little red light blinked on. A few weeks later, when the noise had started to die down and the headlines faded to the next trending outrage, Byron Leach found himself alone by the pond again. The water was still, catching the light of an early evening sun. Cicadas hummed in the distance, their rhythm steady and familiar. For the first time in months, the neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. He sat in the same old chair that Leah used to drag out for their summer picnics. Mocha curled up beside him, tail flicking lazily. The air smelled like wet earth and honeysuckle. The creek murmured nearby, alive and free, winding exactly where it wanted to go. He closed his eyes for a moment. All he could hear was the water and the rustling leaves. It didn't sound like rebellion anymore. It sounded like peace. A knock on the fence pulled him from the thought. It was Paula Monroe again, this time holding 2 glasses of iced tea. Thought you might need this, she said with a smile. Byron grinned. You just like being part of the winning team, she laughed softly. Please, you think anyone really wins with an HOA? They sat for a while, sipping tea in comfortable silence. Finally, Paula said, You know, I think people needed this. Not the fight, but the reminder. What reminder's that? Byron asked. That rules are supposed to protect people, not cage them, she said. You didn't fight for water, Byron. You fought for common sense. He smiled at that. She wasn't wrong. Later that evening, Byron decided to take one more walk through the neighborhood. It looked different now, not because of the flood or the news, but because of how people carried themselves. Kids played near the pond without parents rushing to scold them. Neighbors talked across driveways again. Someone had even started planting wildflowers along the creek, letting color return where it had once been forbidden. As Byron passed the community board, he noticed a new announcement pinned to it. Residents are encouraged to participate in the Lakeshore Meadows Green Initiative promoting sustainable gardening, natural water collection, and environmental restoration. Inspired by local resident Mr. Byron Leach, he stared at it for a long moment. Then he chuckled under his breath. Guess nature joined the HOA after all. The next morning, he got a call from Melissa Truitt, the reporter who'd interviewed him. "Byron, I just wanted to let you know," she said. "Your story's being included in a national feature about environmental responsibility and community reform." He sighed lightly. "I didn't mean for it to turn into a movement." "I think that's what makes it work," she replied. "You didn't force anything. You just reminded people that sometimes letting go of control is the solution." He thanked her, hung up, and walked outside again. The grass was still damp with morning dew, the air warm but gentle. The barrels, now painted a neutral shade after all the chaos, stood quietly by his fence, full of clear water. They weren't defiant anymore. They were part of the landscape. A few houses down, Eddie Larson waved from his driveway. "Hey, Byron! Got my own setup now," he called out proudly, pointing to a row of new rain barrels. "Figured if it's legal now, might as well do it right." Byron laughed. "Just make sure Gloria's ghost doesn't show up with a clipboard." Eddie grinned. "If she does, I'll offer her a drink." Byron walked back to his porch, sat down, and took a slow breath. The wind rippled across the pond, sending small circles outward, one after another. That's how change worked. Not all at once, but in ripples. One person does the right thing, and someone else finds courage in that. He thought about Leah again. Her voice, her warmth, how she used to tell him that patience wasn't about waiting quietly, but standing steady when things didn't make sense. Maybe that's what he'd done, without even realizing it. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in orange and gold, Byron spoke softly, not to anyone in particular. "Nature doesn't hurry, but it gets everything done. I guess we should too." He stood up, dusted off his jeans, and looked around the neighborhood, his neighborhood, finally at peace. There was something satisfying about knowing he didn't win by yelling or fighting or breaking rules. He'd won by trusting something bigger, older, and wiser than any HOA regulation. Balance. He turned back toward the camera he'd set up earlier to record a message for the online audience that had grown around his story. The little red light blinked on. He looked straight into the lens and said, "If this story taught me anything, it's that sometimes you don't have to fight nature or people to be heard. You just have to do what's right and let the truth take care of itself. Don't be afraid to stand up for what makes sense, even if it's small, because small things, they grow. Just like this." He paused, his expression softening. "If you've been watching this far, thank you. And if you believe stories like this matter, hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes we all need reminders that doing the right thing doesn't have to make noise to make change." He gave a gentle nod, turned off the camera, and watched the sky turn darker, the last streaks of light fading behind the trees. The creek murmured in the background, steady as ever. Proof that nature and truth always find their way. And with that, Byron Leach finally let it all go, knowing the world had already heard the message he never meant to shout.